So here in Wisconsin, we have engaged in school improvement efforts for decades. And
Like
right now
everybody
we
else.
Have,
Yeah.
yep, but we also have the largest achievement gap
Mhm.
in the nation right now. And we're just wondering a little bit around, we've made so little progress in closing that gap. What might be some reasons for that? And not just in Wisconsin, but nationally.
It's a national problem. And our achievement gap is one, we just have a social gap, economic gap, housing gap, healthcare gap. So the achievement gap is just one appendage or one spoke on the wheel. So there's an external set of contributors, but there's also internal. My argument is that inequity is palatable. That as long as there's not dissatisfaction, then there won't be change. One of my favorite authors is Eric Hoffer, and he's a social scientist. He's passed away. But he studied mass social movements in a book that really sums this called The True Believer. And he gets into the nature of mass movements, like women's suffrage, like civil rights movement, like the French Revolution. These people didn't have like a dog whistle. What made all these people come together for this mass movement? And he said the key ingredient is mass dissatisfaction. That discontent is different than dissatisfaction. Discontent means it's annoying, I recognize it's not fair, but I can live with it. People can live with the achievement gap. Only when it becomes dissatisfaction do we see motion. Let me give you an example. When Common Core was rolled out, Common Core was developed for a good reason. The standards are very rigorous. The state's desire to collaborate was very good. You create consortia of states, and Arizona can share with California, and California, we can look at, it's like PLC, we're looking at common formative assessment. Why are kids knocking it out of the park in Montana, but struggling in Indiana? And we can share, here's our invest. It's PLC at a mass stage. As the New York experiment was rolled out, and Park was piloted in New York, and they found on average that student performance was 50% lower in proficiency than on the traditional New York State test. Now superintendents had to go back to their constituencies and say, I can't explain to you all the nuances of Common Core, but these kids you thought that were super brilliant, turns out they're not quite as brilliant as you thought. We were 95% proficient on the old state multiple choice tests, but when we have rigorous standards where kids have to demonstrate at multiple levels, we're at about 40%. So that price you paid for your home, which was 5 times what it would have been in any other environment, can't justify that anymore. And communities all around the country where they were used to privilege stood up and they were lobbying. People started dropping Common Core like a hot potato. They were abandoning it, abandoning the assessments and the consortium that they were in, either Park or Smarter Balance, and now it's just a small handful of states who use it as it was designed. Why did that change happen? Because it was a constituency that as a society we were empathetic for. As long as kids in Milwaukee, in Detroit, in Chicago are looked at as disposable, we'll never develop the social will to make the changes necessary to build equity. Inequity is convenient until it affects me. That's why we still have an achievement gap.
So when you think about that, so I think you've addressed some of this question around mindsets, but how do we start to impact some of those mindsets? Because I think about the language we use around creating a sense of urgency, but it's the dissatisfaction that we need to get at and impacting mindsets. So what are some thoughts you have around?
Well, it starts with looking at data and concrete evidence and calling people on their moral hypocrisy. If you go to any school in the state of Wisconsin or anywhere in the country, you read their mission statements, it almost makes you want to burst into a chorus of We Are the World. We want every child to be lifelong. They go through the whole spiel. Then later evidence around equity next to that and make them deal with it. Then I would recommend providing some exemplars, examples practices that other schools have used to strategically address some of the issues of equity that each school has. What have schools done about a vocabulary gap? What have they done about disproportionate suspensions? What have they done about disproportionate identification for special ed? Because identifying the problem is just the first stage. Okay, now you got my interest. Now what do I do about it? Because if the theory is the problem is the student and it's an insurmountable obstacle, you just identified a problem and quantified it when they probably picked it up intrinsically anyway. Quantifying it just creates a sense of urgency. Now with that sense of urgency, you have to follow it up with skills and tools and strategies and structures that effectively address that. And then you have to build a culture where we hold people accountable for using those. If we do that, each individual school has hope. Because we're seeing some schools nationwide who've moved the needle on equity. We just haven't seen it in mass, at scale. So we know how to do it. My kind of input is we probably won't see it in mass until there's a universal cry for equity. But that doesn't mean that Johnson Elementary School can't start working on equity tomorrow.
We've experienced some pushback when we've even gently started to push against mindsets that might continue inequitable outcomes. If we were to think big, because this is really a huge endeavor, but start small, because I think it is going to happen step by step, one school at a time. What are some steps that we could take immediately to start down the road to equitable outcomes for all students? And what advice would you give to school leaders in Wisconsin as they face the challenge of closing the gaps?
Well, anytime you're looking at large-scale change, you got to start small and to do some pilots. Start with some low-hanging fruit. Schools or districts where the staff and leadership actually want equitable outcomes, because that's where you're going to really prove to those who are resistant or apprehensive that this can actually work. A good model is what's happening in Arkansas. Arkansas chose the PLC at Work model as their ESSA school improvement protocol. And they're taking a non-punitive approach. Schools that have been identified as failing, they built PLC centers across the state, trained a cohort of consultants, coaches, created a protocol of training, and they have these model schools that they're working with. And they hired a company out of Oregon, a think tank, to do objective empirical research and analyze the impact of this practice. And they're going to put out a report about the impact. They're using that model as a way of proving that a certain set of practices work. Then their plan is to scale it up for the state and say, now that we have evidence that this works, now we're expecting each one of you to do it. I think that model is very workable. I think it's reasonable. Looking at something the scale of the entire state, so start with some low-hanging fruit. Make some investments in some areas you think you can make some real progress, and use those schools and those environments as models for duplicating and scaling it up at a larger level. That would be my advice.
Okay, thank you. How long do you think it's going to take us?
It's sad that I don't know, and this is why. Because whenever we think we're making progress, they just move the goalposts. If you read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow,
Oh, yeah.
discrimination just morphs and changes forms. And until we lose the desire to change forms, then I don't know. I think one thing that has to be addressed, though, is that every marginalized community has to accept its own responsibility for self-efficacy. It becomes convenient to always look at others as perpetrators and not take self-responsibility. In my book, Overcoming the Achievement Gap Trap, I did kind of an historical analysis of recent world movements. They're all organically and intrinsically developed. I can't find one movement that was the result of external philanthropy or external stimulation. From India and Nehru and their math and science revolution, to the growth of China as a world leader, Japan after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the investment they made in transforming their society. So though I can look at government, I can look at racism, classism, sexism, people who are marginalized have a responsibility for their own agency. Frederick Douglass said that power concedes nothing without a demand. So I'm equally as honest with communities who allow themselves to be victims and don't embrace their own power of change. Things will become equitable when you demand it.
I really appreciated that in that book, actually, that mindset presentation. I appreciated that.
Because I have to give you permission to marginalize me. If I don't give you permission, then you can't do it. You can try, but you can't make me feel a certain way. That's the benefit of my mother and grandmother's tutelage. That I've never walked into a situation feeling inferior. Like you owe me something.
So one last big, to quote Rick Dufour, big, hairy, audacious piece of advice. What would you tell us?
It's really pretty simple. Student by student, standard by standard. There are white middle-class kids struggling in Wisconsin.
Yes,
There are rich kids struggling in Wisconsin. There are kids who come from two-parent homes struggling in Wisconsin. If our mindset is student by student, standard by standard, whatever it takes, we won't even have to have an equity conversation.
And it's the responsibility of the adults in the school
To get them.
to make sure it happens.
And to use our resources in ways that make sense, to make investments in where our students' needs are. It'll look different in Brown Deer than it will look in Toma or in Madison. But the outcome should be similar.
Thank you
you.
so much for your time. It's
Thank
been a
you.
pleasure
Thank you.
talking with you today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good luck, Wisconsin.